So now we're going to begin our panel of tenured faculty. And as before, I'll introduce our panelists, and they'll say some remarks about, in this case, navigating their professional path as a scholar. For both new junior faculty, but also we have a number of tenured senior faculty that are new to Harvard as well. So perspectives for all of you, and how they've navigated their paths and their careers here. So we have Youngme Moon, who's the Donald K. David Professor of Business Administration and the Senior Associate Dean for Strategy and Innovation at the Harvard Business School. Youngme received her PhD from Stanford, as well as her master's from Stanford, and her bachelor's degree from Yale. Prior to joining the business school, she was on the faculty at MIT. At HBS, she teaches and has taught in all of the major programs and has served as chair and senior associate dean for the MBA program. So she has a lot of academic as well as administrative experience and prowess to share with us. Amy Wagers is the Forst Family Professor of Stem Cell and Regenerative Biology at Harvard University, as well as senior investigator in the section on islet cell and regenerative biology at the Joslin Diabetes Center. And she's an HHMI early career scientist and a member of the Paul F. Glenn Laboratories for the Biological Mechanisms of Aging at Harvard Medical School. So I bet you'd have a lot to say about time management, juggling all those roles. Amy received her PhD in immunology and microbial pathogenesis from Northwestern University. I should have done vocal exercises before the day. And completed her postdoctoral training in stem cell biology at Stanford. Her research seeks to understand how changes in stem cell activity impact tissue homeostasis and repair throughout life. And we have Charles Waldheim, who's the John E. Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at the Graduate School of Design. Charles received his Bachelor of Design from the University of Florida and his Master's of Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. His research examines the relations between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism. We're absolutely delighted to have our three distinguished colleagues here today. So we'll open it up, and we'll start with Youngme.
Hi, everyone. How are you all doing today? So it sort of has the feel of a Senate hearing or something, except there's just not enough paparazzi. Next time we've got to fix that. Okay. So Elizabeth and Judy suggested that we started out by just giving a few words of advice, and it feels a little bit presumptuous. You know, I don't even know you, and I'm just going to start spewing some advice, but here we go. I'm going to just start out giving a few words of advice, and then we can open it up after we've all done that to questions. So I was thinking about this the other day, and I was trying to be very pithy about how I provided some advice to you. So the first piece of advice I have is so when you first get to Harvard, it can be a really sort of intimidating place because it's so big. And so my first piece of advice is to remember that, in fact, Harvard can be as big or as small as you want it to be. And so you're best off making it as big or as small as you need it to be when you need it to be. When I first started at Harvard, the place seemed so large and sort of impenetrable. I just didn't even know how to access different pieces of the institution. And so what I did is I made it really small. And I just settled into one small corner of the university, my little niche, and I just started to get some work done. And I just got productive. And I got very comfortable. And this was hugely important to me. There came a time, however, probably about a year and a half later, where I probably started to get a little bit too comfortable. And that was when I really needed to sort of pick my head up, look around, begin to start to see what was around me, and begin to try to build some bridges to interesting people and organizations across the university, which ended up being stimulating in a very different way. If I look back at my years at Harvard, I would say I've really gone back and forth on this. If you spend all your time making the place really small, you're probably going to end up with a very insular kind of experience here. On the other hand, if you spend all of your time making the place really big, you can get very easily distracted. There are lots of really bright, shiny objects out there that can capture your attention, and you can become seduced by, and you'll never get anything done. So what my first piece of advice is to make Harvard as big or as small as you need it to be when you need it to be, all right? My second piece of advice is to really try to make an effort to make connections with people, not just in your cohort, but with senior faculty, both inside and outside of your department. And I know that sounds really trite, and it seems completely obvious, but in fact, the reality is it's a little bit tricky. And the reason it's a little bit tricky is if you look around at our senior faculty, there is huge variance in how approachable people are, okay? And so it is very easy to say, okay, I'm just going to gravitate toward the people who seem really approachable. And I'm going to sort of shy away from the people who don't seem so approachable. My advice to you is to take a very different approach to this. If you let approachability dictate who you try to build relationships with, you are going to miss out on relationships with some of the most phenomenal people here, okay? The truth of the matter is, when you meet someone who is not very approachable, there are a lot of reasons why they might not be approachable. Them not liking you or not being interested in you is probably really far down the list. Right up at the top of the list is probably social awkwardness, okay? In fact, so my piece of advice here is never underestimate how socially awkward the senior faculty at Harvard can be. We are intensely, pathologically socially awkward, and we are intimidated like crazy by youth. There's something about your energy and your inquisitiveness and your skepticism that makes us feel old and very intimidated, okay? And so what that means is that you need to build a bridge. You need to figure out a way to have senior faculty be comfortable with you, because if they're not approachable, there is a very high likelihood that it's just clumsiness. Really, it's just clumsiness, and they don't know how to relate to you. They don't know how to connect to you. So don't let approachability dictate who you try to build relationships with. The final piece of advice I have is, so you really need to remember what's important as a junior faculty member. So your life's going to get really complicated very quickly. You're going to have so many pressures on a day-to-day basis. You're going to have all kinds of demands, and you're going to start to feel stretched. I look around the room, and my guess is that all of you are overachievers, and you have been for most of your lives, which means that you have been competing and winning for most of your life, right? It would be very natural for you to begin this part of your journey with that same sort of mindset. And so my advice here is to just remind you that it is no longer about that, okay? It's no longer about trying to prove that you're the smartest person in the room or demonstrating that you're worth being here, and it's certainly not about trying to figure out what boxes do I need to check to get to tenure. That's not what it's about. What it's about is it's about figuring out how to navigate this part of your life in a manner that inspires you and leaves a deep impression on the community of scholars around you. That's what it's about. And it's about building a life, a multidimensional life, a life full of impact and a life full of meaning. So now, what does this mean? It means thinking really hard about the contribution you want to make and making sure that it has the right amount of ambition, that it's actually worth dedicating a big chunk of your life to. It means thinking really hard about where you put your energy. Are you applying it to the right things in the right proportion? The easiest thing to lose when you're junior faculty is perspective. It is very easy to get caught up in the tactics of being a junior faculty person here. Right? Just the tactics. Do I say yes to this committee? No. You could spend hours endlessly talking about the tactics of being a junior faculty person. My advice to you is to try to elevate yourself above that every once in a while and keep your perspective, because at the end of the day, there are only two things that are going to matter, okay? When you're finished with your junior years, only two things are going to matter. The first thing that's going to matter is the work that you've done, the contribution you've made. Is it meaningful? Have you moved the conversation forward in a significant way? And the second thing that's going to matter is all the stuff that's happened in the meantime. Because as you're working to produce that contribution, somewhere between 5 and 10 years of your life is going to fly by. These are prime years, people. And if you're lucky, some pretty profound things are going to happen during that time. Maybe you find your life partner. Maybe you decide to start a family. Whatever is important to you, right? In other words, in this next phase of your life, there are going to be lots and lots of moving pieces. The only way to keep it together is to not get bogged down too much in the small stuff, okay? Don't get so hung up on the petty stuff. Don't obsess about the tactics, okay? Try to keep your eye on the big picture. Try to remember what's important. That's my advice. Wow, we're going to get applause? Okay. I would have kept going if I knew that I would get applause at the end.
Before we move on, I thought your comments were really helpful. We do have a number of new senior faculty in the room as well.
Good luck to you guys as well.
So
It's all about the tactics
Yes,
now.
yes.
any particular advice for?
Be really good to the junior faculty. That's my advice.
Thank you. Amy?
Great, thanks very much. So welcome, everybody, and I'm happy to see you all here, and I hope that we can provide some useful advice. I also agree with everything that Youngme has said, and I think I'm gonna focus my comments maybe in a slightly different area and talk a little bit about mentorship, both getting it and giving it. I think that in navigating my path here at Harvard, that has been a really key element. From the time I arrived here, and my trajectory here was a little bit different in the sense that, just to provide some background, I started my career at Harvard actually at the medical school at an institution called the Joslin Diabetes Center, where I started my laboratory, and I was in the academic department, was the Department of Pathology. I studied stem cell biology, and I was the only stem cell biologist at the Joslin at the time. And I started, building my lab, and walked in, and there was a pencil and a trash can, and I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? And I sat down at my computer and I wrote an email to somebody who at the time scared me to death. But I was one of the scientists in the stem cell field that I respected the most, and that was Doug Melton. I was scared to do this, and this is, I guess, another piece of advice is do things that you think are good for you that scare you. But I wrote to him and I said, you don't know me. I just landed here. I'm a junior faculty over across the river, and I'm working on stem cell biology, and I'd love to come over and tell you about what we're doing and get some advice. So this was kind of a bold thing to do, is sort of taking up his time. But he wrote back right away, and he said, that'd be great. I'd love to meet you. Come on over. And we sat down in his office for about 3 hours, and we talked about everything that I was doing. And he said, yeah, that's really interesting. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't do that. That's really pretty boring. And it was really a fantastic conversation, and it continued, and we continued to meet again and again. And then 4 years later, when Doug and David Skadden were founding the new department in stem cell and regenerative biology, they asked me to be one of the founding members of that department, and that's what brought me over here to the FAS. So my advice to you about getting mentoring is be proactive about it. Seek out people that you think will help you, and you'll be surprised often by the response, and it can take you in really fantastic directions. I also have advice about giving mentoring. So you're now in a role for the junior faculty that maybe you haven't been in before, where your people are going to be looking to you for advice and for mentorship. And it's an interesting transition, not one that always is so easy to expect what will change. And many of you probably have been in mentorship roles before, but more and more and more that's going to be asked of you. And more you'll realize that people students, postdocs who may work with you are intricately interested in the details of your personal life, which actually you never thought were very interesting before. But you need to figure out a way to navigate that relationship as well, and how to interact with students in a way that supports them and really leading by example and as a model and a mentor, at the same time that you're seeking out mentorship from others. And so this is a really interesting position to be in. You'll need mentors for your whole life, and you'll be a mentor for your whole life. And this is the sort of entry into that. And in that same way, being proactive is really important. When you see students who are struggling, reaching out to them and helping. When you see someone in your laboratory who's having difficulty with career decisions, figuring out a way to have a conversation with them that helps them navigate that. I think that makes your impact here at Harvard even greater, not just the body of work that you develop, but the influence you have on the lives of the people around you, your students, your colleagues, and think about that as you navigate your career, not just about how you move forward, but how you move everyone around you forward. And I think that builds a really important legacy to what you do here. And then I'm happy to talk about other things as we progress, but that was the one piece of advice I thought I would share with a little anecdote from my past.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Judy, for the invitation to be here. So we decided as a group we would spend most of our time talking with you about the things on your mind, and just open with a few brief remarks. And what I'll have to say really builds very much on what Youngme and Amy have had to say. The first thing that is important for me to say, and this may be more about me than you, I apologize, is I just feel so incredibly fortunate to be here. And I know none of us are here by birthright. You're all here because you've been incredibly successful to date. And the various departments and schools and entities that have invested in you expect us collectively to be a part of the solution going forward. And in that context, I guess for me, the idea that being called upon to profess in these areas of knowledge is a real gift. And that's easy to forget, to lose sight of, or to begin, I think, at certain moments to take too much for granted. So 3 points, in no particular order. The first is a shift that's, in my experience, from junior to mid-career, a shift from simple productivity to real impact. My own experience as a junior faculty member had been that I was just so happy to be productive, to figure out, what the previous panel was discussing about how do I manage my office hours, and how do I get a journal article out, and how do I get the book contract. And I was just, I found myself, exhausted at the end of that process, just so happy that I got something in play, right? And what I want to, contribute here this morning is the idea that that's a floor, not a ceiling. You all are expected to be productive. You already have been. You wouldn't be here. Beyond that, now as I look to build our team in the Department of Landscape Architecture, as I mentor, cultivate, recruit people, I'm really looking at three layers. So beyond productivity, I'm really then interested in reception, right? At the beginning of my career, I thought it was about me. I thought it was about my ideas, and if I got something in print, I thought, well, of course people will see the importance of this. And it took me far too long into the middle part of my career to realize that if I wasn't also able to frame the broader intellectual project for my audiences, if I wasn't able to articulate if what I've put in print is true, and I hope it is, what might be the implication of that be? And it took me just far too long to understand that that was also a part of my own project. And so being able to be inside the work and make the work, but then to step outside of it with sufficient disciplinary context to be able to frame it for your audiences. That took me far too long. I think that you are probably much further along than I was in that process. And then third, transcending the framing of your own intellectual project to be able to talk about impact. At the end of the day, beyond the mechanics of doing work, beyond the process of getting work in play and having an impact in your field, the question is, well, what impact has your work made? And this is maybe, especially at the senior level, the thing that we look at and we talk a lot about is, would your field be discernible in its present configuration absent your contributions? If so, there are plenty of other places that one could be, plenty of other kinds of things one could be engaged in, but ultimately, in this business of disciplinary formation, producing knowledge, not simply productivity, but making some change of the terms of debate. And that's, again, a very lofty goal that's taken me a very, very long time to be able to articulate in my own work, but certainly is a part of what I look for now. Second point has to do with navigating paths, or the metaphors that were given this morning, local versus your own career. Building on my colleagues' comments, my recommendation is that you really focus primarily on your contribution to the body of knowledge in your field. That at the end of the day, in my experience, that will be the most enduring impact of your work professionally and academically. And as you make certain choices, tactical and otherwise, often, in my experience, there will be challenges, conflicts between the contribution that you want to make within your field, the standing that you have as a scholar or a scientist or somebody engaged in the production of knowledge, versus local pressures, right? The provincial pressures of working within a particular colleague or group or lab. And I don't want to minimize them or suggest that they're easy choices, but to be aware of that and to say that you're building your reputation based on your contribution to the body of knowledge in your discipline, and at the same moment, you're a part of a collegial cohort within that discipline here. It happens to be that in many departments, schools, units on this campus, your senior faculty happen to disproportionately represent a significant piece of the senior leadership in your field. So they happen to be quite a large degree of overlap. But at the same moment, to not mistake your senior faculty in your department or school for your field is, again, something that took me far too long to understand. Within that, one of the things that has come up already this morning that I want to reinforce is to be able to, in Youngme's terms, make the school, make the university as small or as large as it needs to be for the task at hand, right? How can you slow the game down in such a way that you can decide when to use the letterhead to your advantage, to gain access, resources, collaborations, when to switch it off so as to actually allow yourself to be productive in other forms. And that, again, it's a kind of it's something that for me came mid-career and far too late, but I would recommend to you. Finally, disciplinary boundaries and questions. Many of us are now, and I think there's, maybe this is a generational thing, are increasingly appointed in departments, schools, programs that are not those in which we're credentialed in. My background is in architecture. I'm now chair of a department of landscape architecture. That makes sense to me. It took me a while to come to terms with that, because for the first 10 years of my career, I described myself as, I'm an architect, I'm working in a department of landscape architecture. And I realized after a while, people don't care. They don't want to hear about your backstory. They want to know about, what's the relevance of having a sociologist teaching in an ed school? What does that mean, right? And in that context, I guess the last thing I would say by way of closing is that while many of the most interesting problems, certainly in my work, I deal with cities, growth, urbanization in response to sea level rise and a range of other environmental drivers, many of the, if not most of the really interesting problems, they resist strict disciplinary boundaries. And at some point, I believe if you want to pursue many of the interesting problems today, really get comfortable with that notion, be able to articulate the limits of one's professional identity, but at the same moment, transcend those boundaries and produce knowledge relative to the problems that we see before us. Thanks.